Celebrating Rod Serling's 100th birthday and the Twilight Zone with Anne Serling, Rod Serling's daughter, and Mark Dawidziak, author of Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone. That's coming up right now. All right, everyone, I'm so excited. Today we are going to be celebrating the Twilight Zone. So I have two special guests today. Anne Serling, daughter of Rod Serling and author of As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling, amazing book, and also author of an amazing book, Mark Dawidziak, who wrote Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, amongst a million other books. But we're going to focus on the zone today. We're going deep. It's depending on when you listen to this, it would have been on Christmas, but Rod Serling's 100th birthday. So we're still celebrating this man, and he's such a huge impact 100 years later. I mean, that's just in itself got amazing. When you reflect on that, and or Mark, or both, like what do you think is it that resonates that here we are 100 years later and he's so relevant still?
I think he's still relevant because he dealt with issues that are still sadly relevant and prevalent today. Racism, anti-Semitism, and I think also because so many of the themes he wrote about are relatable. Walking Distance is one of my and many others' favorites. You know, the whole idea of going back in time and seeing people you loved.
And then realizing you really can't go back in time. And I just rewatched that one as well. It's amazing. I'm sitting there watching it. I'm like, oh my God, that is a little baby Ron Howard. Yeah, Ron Howard. It's such a great episode. 10 cents for a 3-scoop shake. It's amazing. Is Mark, do you feel the same way about that episode? Is that in your top?
Well, that episode and Rod too. I mean, I think that one thing that the Twilight Zone is been kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword for Rod Serling's enduring fame. But one thing, it's immortal, and the Twilight Zone unquestionably is the major factor as to why we're still talking about Rod Serling and those amazing life lessons. But it sometimes obscures the fact that this was an amazingly complete writer who had a lot of facets to his career, and he was much more than just the Twilight Zone. But one of the things that is consistent with his career, whether you're talking about the dramas he wrote in the 1950s, like Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight, or what he wrote after the Twilight Zone, there's a remarkable American writer here. And I think that this is something I always try to say, is that you diminish a writer when you put something in front of their name. When you say science fiction writer or horror writer, or Rod Serling was a lot of different kinds of writer, and he was, to my mind, a great writer. And the great writers are always timeless, and that's because the one thing that they have in common is they're amazingly perceptive observers of human nature. They understand human nature. Shakespeare, we're still, hundreds of years later, we're still delving into Shakespeare's stories, and it's because Shakespeare's stories are still relevant, even though they're set in a different time. They're set in things that we can't even begin to relate to, courts and the Italian cities, and that he sets his plays. And why are they still relevant? It's because Shakespeare gets right to the heart of it and who we are, and he shows us who we are. In our own country, Mark Twain is like that. How many times does it seem like when we quote Mark Twain, it sounds like he's talking about us today? Rod Serling is like that. And one of the things about Rod Serling's writing is, this has often been said by me, that Rod Serling's writing is of its time. You watch an episode of Walking Distance, and it's clearly set in an era that did not know cell phones or home computers or any of that. And yet it's of its time, but it's timeless. It still seems like he's talking to us today. And as you said, a lot of episodes of the Twilight Zone are more relevant today than when they were written. And that's because human nature doesn't change. Sad to say, we don't change. So the lessons that were crafted in a different era, in a different time, you know, the Twilight Zone starts during the Eisenhower administration in 1959. And the life lessons that were crafted in 1959, some of them are even more relevant today. So I think that's, you know, probably a long answer to your question, but I think it's important to remember that, again, Rod Serling was not just a great fantasy writer. He was not a great science fiction writer. I happen to think that Rod Serling was one of the great writers of all time.
Which people don't change.
No, sad to say, they don't.
On that theme, I was rewatching a bunch of episodes and watching the monsters are due on Maple Street. And it's really interesting when you can watch something and you're like, it does feel like it could have just been written and you're like, oh, a little on the nose for, you know what I mean? But like, but not, I mean, it had, you know, if someone had written it today or something like that, but to know that it was written so long ago and, you know, decades ago, and it literally could play out exactly that way right now, like that people don't change, which in itself is a little upsetting that we aren't evolving in that way. But
there's a program in Binghamton where my dad was from called The Fifth Dimension, where all the fifth graders watch the Twilight Zones and they learn about racism and anti-Semitism and scapegoating, mob mentality, etc. And one of the teachers was showing the episode, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. And at the end of the show, she asked the class, so who are the monsters? And she said the entire class stood up. They really understand the themes of these. And I think it would have been one of my dad's greatest accolades to know this program exists and fifth graders are understanding this.
Yeah, and that episode really is a prime example of what we're talking about, because there's no question that when Rod wrote that piece, and it aired originally in 1959, we had just come through the McCarthy era. We had just come through this era of the Red Scare and all of this anti-communist paranoia, and neighbor turning on neighbor and coworker turning on coworker, and everybody looking for communists under the bed. And, you know, maybe it's your neighbor. How can you tell? They look like everybody else. Clearly, that's what he was writing about. But that episode has more resonance today than when it aired, because we have become increasingly divided as a nation. And, you know, there's a very stirring lesson in that episode, which, you know, is the same warning that Lincoln tried to give us, which is divided we fall. You know, if we do not find a way forward, if we descend into this kind of paranoia about our fellow countrymen, and we are not the United States of America, we ain't going to make it. And that's a very stirring message in 1959. It's a very powerful message in 1959, but in a lot of ways, it's more powerful now. If I could pass a bill, well, hell, the politicians in Washington can't pass a bill now; they're incapable. But if I had the ability to pass it, it would be to mandate that everybody in the country has to sit down and watch this episode, just to get this message through, that we are not the enemy. Your fellow citizens are not the enemy. See how that little town on Maple Street descends into chaos and madness because of all those things. Powerful message. So, you know, right there, you have answered your own question of why are we still talking about Rod Serling as we approach the 100th anniversary of his birth. There's your answer.
Yes, 100%. And like, just to reflect again on this episode and just in rewatching it, it's like, because obviously social media didn't exist at the time, but it kind of, as I was watching it now, you watch things with new eyes as you watch things throughout your life. The way that they were manipulating each other into turning on the different people throughout the episode, as quickly as they were, now is what happens on social media through the advent of fake news or misinformation, where people take everything in and immediately pivot on that as a fact and then react to it as if it was truth. And this was happening in real time with the group on Maple Street, as one would say, maybe it's Anne. Why is Anne's lights all of a sudden on? Right. And then they would just turn on each other left and right. And then not until the one guy, I always thought it was interesting too, in rewatching it, like when the guy shoots the guy who went to the other street, and then suddenly realizes, it's easy to be this way until there's consequences for an action that you ultimately do take. So it was like a little bit of a, kind of a warning there too. But then just to see how easy it is to be manipulated, which is really what's happening at the end of that episode. They're being manipulated by aliens, right? So the kid was right all along. The little boy that warns them. But like, it's an amazing episode. It's a Good Life, I thought, had some interesting themes to it too, that in watching it now, where the all-powerful leader that everyone knows shouldn't be in power, but it's gotten to the point where everyone's too afraid to do anything.
Yep.
Go ahead, Ann.
I just was agreeing with comment.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I don't think that one was the original intent of the story. I think we are. It's an interesting interpretation to sort of put a 2024 spin on that story, and it works. It's valid. That's what is great about fantasy storytelling. Fantasy storytelling tends to be metaphoric. The metaphoric lessons that you draw from the story changes from generation to generation, depending on what's in, because these stories tend to reflect our fears, our hopes, our nightmares, our dreams. That's what science fiction, horror, fantasy does almost better than any other genres out there. You can see that with you can see a classic piece of literature like Dracula, and you could say, well, it was interpreted in many different ways when it was published in 1897. But each generation has metaphorically reinterpreted that story because what's in the culture changes a little bit. And we say, oh, well, maybe it's, Dracula was read as an AIDS metaphor in the 90s. Well, Bram Stoker clearly did not know what AIDS was. It had not been discovered yet. It had not been. So, but it works. It does work that way. It's a very malleable form for us to sort of address our own fears and anxieties and hopes and dreams and aspirations. So you take an episode like It's a Good Life. Now, we know what the origins of It's a Good Life. The original author, Jerome Bixby, saw children misbehaving in a restaurant. It was his comment on parenting. It was his comment on people who just let their kids run their lives and run wild. And this was a spoiled child. But now you flash forward, 50 years later, and 60 years later, and you're looking at that episode and you say, well, maybe there is a political message here that fits our time. It's a very malleable form, and it changes for us as societies, and it changes for us as individuals, because you can watch a Twilight Zone episode when you're 10 years old, when you're 15 years old, when you're 20 years old, when you're 30 years old, and what you get out of it changes because you're a different person at each of those, and you're bringing different things to the experience of watching those episodes. You can stay with the Twilight Zone your entire life, and it still be fresh and still be new, and that's a powerful part of the storytelling, and that's another reason we're still talking about Rod Serling, and it's still is but even with all the things we've been talking about, how what a keen observer of human nature that he was, of all of the things that he was interested in, like racism and bigotry and ignorance, and how we treat children and how we treat the elderly, and all of these things that he was passionately interested. Behind all of that was a great storyteller. These are great. The Twilight Zone is great storytelling. And how do we learn? From the various first things you were given as a child, how do we learn? We learn through stories. You know, you study and you gain knowledge by going into a classroom, but you truly learn through storytelling. And that's what the Twilight Zone is. And that's what Rod Serling was. He was a magnificent storyteller.
He was. And I mean, to answer, my thoughts on the answer to that question is, one is, it's amazing to not only have written the great works, but also to have kind of encapsulated himself as part of that, as the narrator, right? And I think he in himself is so memorable. In rewatching a lot of these episodes, I realized what we today call hooks is there's a lot of really solid hooks of like the ones that we consider like the classic ones that might come to anyone's mind right away, like the glasses breaking at the end, or the image of the guy on the airplane, the monster on the wing, right, in 20,000, or Eye of the Beholder, where like that reveal with the pretty and the difference of beauty, or like just all these things had such specific things that I remember in my head. And then in rewatching, I was able to like enjoy the full story again, because it'd been a little bit since I had watched all of it through. Obviously every New Year's Eve, we all watch the marathons and stuff. But like, what I'm saying? But there's such iconic things that are so easy to remember and associate with, that these stories stay with us for those reasons, I think, as well.
This may not be connected to what you're saying, but as you've both been speaking, I've been thinking about the number of people who told me that they thought of my dad as their own father. And some said that they had tumultuous childhoods, and it was really the Twilight Zone and watching the episodes that helped them work through that and navigate whatever pain they were experiencing. And I was quite touched by that, as my dad would have been.
I think your dad impacted a lot of people. I remember like I put some of the Twilight Zone stuff, but on my bookshelf, half of one thing of my bookshelf right now, always, not just because we're talking, is all Twilight Zone stuff. Like every DVD, I have the whole collection on there, and then books and an autobiography and yearbook. You got the Twilight Zone companion. Mark, sorry, yours is on Kindle, so I can't hold it up. But
Counts.
but it's just like I remember watching, and it's like I could see where somebody might make that connection, because your dad's the one getting us through these stories as well. He's not only the one writing them and telling them, but he's there at the beginning, he's there at the end to help us as the guide, and to take us through it, and to make us feel good about the lesson or what we just saw.
It's a good point, but it also one of the reasons we make this kind of connection with Rod Serling that we don't often make with other writers is because Rod Serling was one of the very few writers in history, all of history, who was a true, genuine 24 karat celebrity. And it was because of television. He was instantly recognizable. His voice was recognizable. His mannerisms were recognizable. We felt like we knew him because he came into our homes on such a regular basis. There are not many writers who you could just show a picture of them to somebody, and the average American would have a shot at knowing who they were. Try it with Herman Melville and see how many people know when you're holding up a picture of, Herman Melville or Emerson, or Saul Bellow, or even Norman Mailer, somebody like that. There are very few writers who are really instantly recognizable. One is Mark Twain. You know, Twain is you show a picture of Mark Twain to people, they got a good shot at it. They've got a decent shot. And the same is true with Rod Serling. With that comes another side of it, which is we saw the person who was on the screen. And the person who was, it's like what I was saying about the writer, you perceive only a part of what is there. Rod Serling was not the person you saw on the screen. You know, he was, it is what kind of made that connection, what it made him instantly. And it's why I always say to people, you know, if you want to know the real Rod Serling, if you want to get to know, read Anne's book. Anne's book is the only way you're going to get that person, the real person. And I think it surprises people when you read Anne's book and you find out what he was really like. You know, which again, you know, he wasn't that super serious guy. It's talking in those clipped tones that that he used to introduce the Twilight Zone. That's why that book is so. It's one of the reasons, one of many reasons, that book is such a valuable book. There's many more, but not the least of which is for somebody like me who never met Rod Serling, who never had the honor of meeting Rod Serling. This is as close as I'm going to get to feel like, you know, you're actually drawing close to the real flesh and blood presence of who this person was.
I agree. It's an amazing read. So, Anne, tell us what are some of the biggest misconceptions about your dad?
He wasn't this somber person that you see, this dark and black and white image. He was so funny. He would do things like disappear out of a room and reappear with a lampshade on his head. He did the best gorilla imitation you could imagine, as is seen in almost every home movie. He had a fabulous singing voice. He would belt out Sinatra and Tony Bennett throughout the house. If he got mad at you, you would know, and he'd be very angry. And then he'd walk out of the room. And then about 5 minutes later, he'd reappear and say, "Have you seen my twin brother anywhere?" He loved the Flintstones. We weren't allowed to watch TV during the week, my sister and I, my mother's rules, but my dad and I would sneak more than the occasional episode of the Flintstones. He was just incredibly fun to be with. As a teenager, I never went through that phase where I didn't want to be with my dad or hang out with my dad. He was a joy to hang out with. He cracked me up. My mother used to say, "Stop laughing at him. You're only encouraging him."
It sounds amazing. I think if I remember correctly in the book, you were about 4 when the Twilight Zone debuted. So if it went, so from 4 to 9 or so, 9, 10, depending on how long the 5 seasons ran. But were you aware of the fame that it was going on? Could you guys go to a restaurant? Like, what was it like, and what was your perception as such a young child, kind of just witnessing that?
Well, when I was very young, I had friends whose dads were writers. So I knew my father wrote, but I didn't know until I was about 7 exactly what he was writing. And that only happened when this mean kid on the playground asked me if I was something out of the Twilight Zone. And he said, "Where does your dad get all his ideas, hanging from the ceiling?" So I had no idea what this little obnoxious kid was talking about. So I went home and I asked my father what that meant. And he explained that he wrote for a series, The Twilight Zone, and it was probably too old for me. And the first one I ever saw was Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. My dad and I were sitting at the cottage in the living room, and I was looking from my father to this episode and feeling quite terrified and just in shock that this was the kind of stuff my father was writing. Even though my dad didn't write that one, it was Richard Matheson. He was still connected to this. So it was a wee bit unsettling initially, because this wasn't my dad.
It's so interesting. I mean, as a kid, that probably sounded like an insult. Hearing you say it as an adult, if someone said it now, you'd be like, "Oh, yeah, yeah."
Yeah.
That would be like, yeah, of course, a high honor. Thank you.
I'd
Oh
like to
man.
go back to that moment now and do that. That's a good idea.
But you can't because we learned that from walking distance.
Right.
So, all right, so, yeah, it's all tying together. Mark, I was reading when we talk about like tying into like common current day stuff. I was reading at the beginning of your book, "Time Enough at Last," how you felt the character was wrongly punished. I thought that
Yeah.
was an interesting take on that.
It's an outlier for me. I realized that this episode is many people's favorite episode, and it certainly contains the strongest visual image associated with the Twilight Zone, which is the broken glasses. I have no arguments with the people who want to talk about how well acted it is, how powerfully framed the story is. Uh, Meredith's performance is astonishing. I have no complaints with that, but the Twilight Zone does operate under certain rules, and that is that you are punished and rewarded for what you bring into the Twilight Zone, and that character is punished far beyond anything that he does in that episode. He, in fact, is not the villain of the episode. He is, the wife is one of the worst characters ever put on screen. She's horrible. She's beyond horrible. And it also, the message kind of dates badly. It's like, well, he's kind of a foolish person because why? Oh, he wants to read. And now all these years later, you go, really? That's his crime? He wants to read? How awful of him to want to read. We're now in a world where the printed word is under fire and books are being banned. And it's like, I think the message of that episode is dated badly. However, in the book, I was drawing life lessons from the various episodes. And there was no way I could not attach a lesson to that episode, and there's no way I could ignore it. So the lesson that I put on the episode was something my mother used to say when we would complain about something. One of the kids would complain about something, and one was ultimately would say, "Well, that's not fair." My mother would always say, "Nobody said life was fair." I hated hearing it then. I don't like hearing it now. But I do not deny the wisdom of that. And that was the lesson that I put on that episode was, and he says it at the end when his glasses break and he holds up the broken glasses. He says, that isn't fair. And we agree with him. It isn't fair. And I think one of the reasons that episode is still powerful because it does break the rules of the Twilight Zone. It does it is an outlier. And it is the one time that somebody is punished far beyond anything that he should have coming to him. My favorite Burgess Meredith episode is not Time Enough at Last. It's The Obsolete Man. And I think The Obsolete Man is another episode that has grown and grown. Now here's another character who is a reader, who values books and values the printed word. And Romney Wordsworth, the character that Burgess Meredith plays in The Obsolete Man, he is one of the most heroic characters in all 5 seasons of The Twilight Zone. He emerges as just an amazingly heroic character. And that is my favorite Burgess Meredith episode. And it is one of my favorite Twilight Zone.
So when I read that in your book, it really got me thinking because I had never even thought of it as a punishment. I had just thought of it as one of those amazing twists of fate. And so it was interesting, one, to think about it from the perspective that you put forward in the book. But then I started thinking about it and I was like, I know I put so much thought. So it was going through my head. You got in my head, Mark. And I started thinking, I was like, and not to put today onto the episodes again, but I started thinking maybe it wasn't that he got punished. Maybe it was that was more of a lesson not about specifically reading, but about the focus away from everything and everyone around you. And then I started thinking how we today, if you replaced the books with your phone, right? How everyone stares at the phone and ignores everyone around you, because that's really what he was doing. He was so into the reading that he was giving up the relationship with his wife. He wasn't connecting at work. And at the end, it was like, okay, this is the danger of being so focused and not really being part of the world that you're around. That was
I heard that interpretation of the episode, and I violently disagree with it. And this is why. And this is why. When you're with your phone, you are withdrawn from people. You are not dealing with people. When you are not escaping into a place, you are being just sort of mindlessly taken over robotically by something. When you read, you are escaping sometimes things. It is a place to go. It's like a friend of mine who was a prison guard at a maximum security prison always used to tell the prisoners, read books, because no matter how long you are locked up here, you can get out of here if you read books. And that's what this character is escaping. He's escaping a terrible boss and terrible people and a dreary job and a dreary life. And it's not that he tries to share it. What does he do in the first scene you see him in when he's a bank teller? He's trying to tell the other people about the books he's reading. He's telling them about David Copperfield. And he's trying to tell them, oh, it's a wonderful book. He's not escaping and staying by himself. What's the cruelest moment in the episode? When he tries to share the poetry with his wife. He doesn't want to retreat and just keep it to himself. And one of the great joys in this moment is that she gets it. She gets it. She wants to share this poetry. And then he opens the book and she has defaced every page, which is one of the cruelest and nastiest things anybody has ever done in the Twilight Zone. So I don't agree with that at all, because throughout the episode, he's not shutting down. He's trying to share. And that's not what happens with phones.
And now let's chalk this up as another reason why these are still so memorable, is that we can even have this conversation. So thankfully, and not to put Anne on the spot, we'll let Anne be the tiebreaker.
Well, Mark and I have discussed this episode, and I agree with him. Yet, Joe, and I'm struggling for his last name, I can send it to you, who just wrote a book. He was one of the writers on 30-something. And he confronted my dad with this. Why did this have to happen in this episode? And my father responded something like, well, you can't just draw inward and become narcissistic. But I think had my dad had an opportunity to answer that question, he would have answered it exactly as Mark just did. Because there's too much to that, where this guy is not just withdrawing, he wants to share this love he has of writing and poetry, as Mark so eloquently just said.
Yeah, I think one of the greatest joys of this character would be is if anybody in that episode said, you know, I went home and I read David Copperfield because you were so passionate about it, and I saw such a light in your eyes when you were talking about it. So I went home and it was this wonderful experience. You know, and that's what writing is. That's what Rod Serling did. You know, we do want to share this stuff. I also say, you know, and this is where I'll back off. The life lessons that I put in the book are the life lessons I drew from this. It's not necessarily the life lessons you draw from it. That's what fantasy storytelling it is. It is open to metaphoric interpretation. So if somebody else comes away with a different interpretation of it, that's valid. I'm not going to say, I'll disagree with you, but I'm not going to say you're wrong, because you cannot be wrong in the interpretation you put on the episode. These were my book was 50 life lessons drawn from the Twilight Zone. They're my life lessons, you know, but they're not necessarily your life lessons. I'm always eager to hear what other people's interpretations are for an episode.
I would really like to ask my father, why did you write it like that?
What other questions would you want to ask your father?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Why didn't you quit smoking? There are many, many personal questions. I think one of the things I would ask him about are his war experiences, because clearly that was so central to who my dad was. And I did know some of what had happened to him. And it was one of the most difficult parts of writing my book, actually, was when my dad was in the war, and I had letters that he had written to his parents and that they had written to him. And he was 18. He had enlisted in the army the day after he graduated from high school, and he was writing these letters from training camp, and he was asking for things like candy and gum and hangers. and underwear because he didn't like the GI underwear. And it was like reading letters that a kid at summer camp would read. And it was devastating to read these and then read the things that his parents were telling him. You know, they were so worried about what was going to happen, and knowing now what he was about to face, where he saw true horror in the war. Producer of the Twilight Zone, Buck Houghton, said he thinks my dad turned to writing to regain his affection for humanity. And I think that's a very truthful, powerful statement. A friend of his was decapitated when a food crate fell from the sky, and just dreadful things. My dad wrote a story actually when he was in college that Amy Boyles Johnson found, called First Squad, First Platoon, where my dad talks about 5 of these guys who died. And it's just the horror that we subject these kids to, you know, even today and forever. It's mind-boggling. It's heart-wrenching. And my dad actually he was not going to be a writer. He wanted to major in phys ed when he went to college because he worked at a camp with kids who had rheumatic fever, and he loved working with the kids. So he wanted to teach phys ed to kids, but he went to Antioch College about 3 weeks after he came back from the war, and he was suffering greatly from PTSD, which wasn't even a term back then. So he changed his major to language and literature because, as he said, he needed to get it out of his gut. He needed to get it off his chest. And I knew he had trauma because he had nightmares. And I would remember hearing him scream in the middle of the night, and I would ask him what had happened. And he said, I dreamt the enemy was coming at me. So, but that's something I would want to talk to him about. And also more about his childhood and growing up. His father died when my father was overseas, and although the war was over, but my dad didn't have enough points to go home. So that was a huge trauma for my dad. He always would say to me, if only you had known your grandfather. And it's something I say to my kids now.
What does all this legacy mean to your kids? Because it's an amazing amount to be connected with, and to be able to say, oh, that's my grandpa. You know, I mean, the show keeps getting, you know, rebooted every now and then. There's been movies, it's pop culture, it's everywhere. That must be really rewarding for them and heartwarming for you. Like, how
it is, and it's interesting because my 10-year-old grandson has been asking me about him too, and it's so wonderful, you know, and they're so lucky, and I'm so lucky to you know, where they could look at films and see this man, and not everybody can do that, and we're so fortunate.
Right, there's 100+ episodes. He didn't physically narrate. He wasn't on camera in season 1, but like, yeah, they're all there, and he wrote all these things. So it must be such an amazing thing. It's probably a hell of a show and tell for the kids when they're younger, right? To be able to go in. So speaking of pop culture, like, do you have any favorite, and this is for either of you or both of you, is like any random pop culture moments that reference the Twilight Zone or any of the specific episodes or anything like that?
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say, not really, but it's constant. Can't go a week without somebody saying, I feel like we're in the Twilight Zone, or I'm having a Twilight Zone moment, or I feel like I'm trapped in the. It is referenced constantly in that regard. So it's not so much, you know, a favorite example of that, except that it is and has been constant ever since the show was on. You know, my kind of joy is to see how much the Twilight Zone is influenced in the culture. Is that moving forward, it influences almost everything in storytelling, especially in television. You see the fact that, of course, it's going to influence Star Trek. It's going to influence a lot of the genre storytelling that follows it all the way to today. But what you see is that it actually influences all storytelling in television. You get to a new century, and every single leading writer producer in charge of an acclaimed show, David Chase, Matthew Weiner, Vince Gilligan, they all cite Rod Serling as their primary influence and inspiration. I think that would have amazed Rod, and I think it would have delighted him, because these are really his children. These are, his Anne is his child, but his descendants in TV are numerous, and they're everywhere, and they have reshaped the medium several times over, just as he did. One of the amazing things about him.
And no one would be more shocked than my dad that he still remembered and remembered so fondly. He said that he didn't think his writing would stand the test of time, that it was momentarily adequate.
Oh, well, he was so wrong about that. And but do you have like a moment? Like I always loved it when I think the Simpsons pay homage all the time with the treehouse of horror episodes that they would do. They were always kind of pulling from Twilight Zone episodes. There is a hilarious Pam Anderson Saturday Night Live that with the Eye of the Beholder. There's just like all these little things where it just kind of pops up.
It's constant. But like Mark, I don't really have a favorite. The Tower of Terror is kind of shocking. But, yeah, the Simpsons and all the political, we're living in the Twilight Zone. That's indeed true.
When you said Tower of Terror, do you mean in Florida? That's my favorite thing in the world. Do you love it, or is it weird?
I'm not a roller coaster kind of. It's not really my thing. And when it opened in Florida, they also had one in LA and Paris, I think. But when it opened in Florida, we went for the premiere, and so we had to ride it. And I was actually absolutely terrified, this thing dropping from the sky. It's just not my thing. But we had to ride it like 4 times. So I still don't know if I got better, but we went with our grandkids a couple of years ago. And so of course I was going to ride it. And my granddaughter got quite a kick out of me screaming the entire 12 minutes or whatever it is. It didn't get easier, I have to say.
And I'll take it back. I do have a favorite. There is a moment on the comedy Third Rock from the Sun, which starred John Lithgow. And of course, they were all aliens on there. And they had done an episode. Now, John Lithgow had done the movie segment of The Twilight Zone, the remake of Nightmare at 20,000 Feet in 1983. So he played the frightened passenger in the remake of the episode that had starred William Shatner in the original series written by Richard Matheson. And in the series, the aliens are always in communication with the big giant head who is their leader. And they did an episode where John Lithgow is on a plane, and he, as his character Dick Solomon, and he thinks he sees something on the wing of the plane, and he panics in the episode, and it's a reference to Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. Well, they finally introduce the big giant head, and it's played by William Shatner. So Shatner comes off the plane. They go to meet him, and he gets off his plane. And John Lithgow says to him, how was your flight? And Shatner says, well, it was fine. Halfway through the flight, I thought I saw something on the wing. And Lithgow looks at him and says, the same thing happened to me. And it's a double meta moment of both of them having played that character in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet and referencing it again, it's inside baseball. You have to know that they both played that character in different versions of that story. So I do have a favorite, and I got to know Richard Matheson very well, and he was not aware of that episode until I told him about it. And he, of course, was delighted by the fact that it had reached that level.
Love that. I love that. And then, and do you have, or how many do you have stamps with your dad on it? Yeah.
Yeah, I have the thing framed when it first came out. Yeah.
So when we talk about your dad thinking, with Rod Serling thinking he wasn't going to last, or that people wouldn't remember his writing, the series ended 60 years ago, 1964. That's when the 5-year run ended. It's still to this day, right? Let's see, we got 2023 Variety ranked the Twilight Zone as number 14 on the 100 greatest TV shows of all time. I mean, it's just like, I mean, it's like, and then it's like Rolling Stone number 700th or number 7, the number 8 on the TV this list. It's like, it's incredible to think that a show that old still ranks as one of the absolute best of all time. I mean, if there's a testament to just the longevity and just the amazing writing and impact that Rod Serling had, it's, I mean, I don't think it's just unbelievable to be remembered like that. It's just, I mean, when you think about top 100 shows of all time in 2023, I mean, how many shows have there been? I mean, there's a million shows, right? I mean, it's like, it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. And we have short memories. We have very short pop culture memories. Those lists are always slanted towards the last 20 years. You look at those lists, and whenever those lists are done, if it was done like 20 years ago, the front runners would be shows like The Sopranos and Seinfeld, and now, you'd see a lot of Game of Thrones, and, you'd see different things that are more, because again, we have very short memories, is this. The fact that the Twilight Zone keeps coming in the top 5, top 10, top 15, and you handicap it for those short memories and time, and that it's black and white, that we have gone through several iterations of generations that are resistant to black and white. When you handicap it for all those things, it's almost like saying it's number one. Once you sort of say, okay, yeah, but it is amazing and it does speak to the durability of the show. Absolutely.
I would agree with that as well. It's interesting, like the Dick Van Dyke Show purposely didn't go to color because they wanted all of it to be in black and white, so that it would, as a whole, not get split. Like where Lost in Space, most of the colored ones are the colored episodes are the ones we see in reruns and stuff more than maybe a black and white. You mentioned Star Trek earlier. Desilu, right? Star Trek. Desilu was the kind of like the origin for Star Trek, right? And then through that, and then also the time element, right? I mean, technically, I guess Desi was the first host.
The argument's been made. I
know it's a soft argument. It's not real. I don't mean it as like it was. It's just a fun way to spin the trivia.
Yeah. There are who do say that, though. I mean, we have that's sort of it is prototype Twilight Zone. I mean, it's definitely, you cannot dismiss the time element. It's important, but it was also not the first version of it, that he wrote. It's also not the first fantasy thing that he wrote. So I think you can get a little overstated with if you're not careful. But
true. I know I promised I'd keep you only this long, so you guys are amazing. Do you have any kind of just final thoughts on the core values and principles that we can learn from the Twilight Zone and that we've learned, Mark?
Go ahead, Mark. I'm going to let you go first on this one.
One of the things that I point out in the book, is whenever I give a talk on the Twilight Zone, inevitably, and this sounds like a joke. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, and it isn't. It actually happens. But somebody comes up to me after every single talk, and the person is either a priest, a minister, or a rabbi. And this is true. This is absolutely true. And they come up and they tell me, I use your book in sermons, and when I do talks, I draw life lessons from that. It's one of the highest compliments that I can get as far as the book is concerned. But the compliment really belongs to Rod Serling and the Twilight Zone, because as I said before, storytelling is how we learn. And the Twilight Zone, one of the things that has made it truly immortal and has kept it in, is because these stories are parables. Where have we heard that before? The power of parables. Well, a lot of people think, oh, he's talking about, the New Testament. He's talking about, no, that is true, but you can go all the way back to the Greeks and Aesop's fables, where the unsaid line at the end of every Aesop fable was, and the moral of the story is, and you could say the same thing about the Twilight Zone. When you get to the end of the Twilight Zone, you always had Rod say something at the end, something very powerful and profound about what you have just seen. He's not saying it, but he might as well be saying, and the moral of the story is what? What did you learn? What did you take away from this? I think that's really the power of the show, the power of the Twilight Zone. And I think it's what's kept it going through generation after generation after generation. I think it's going to keep it going. Rod worried that 100 years after his death that people wouldn't remember anything that he wrote. Well, we're 50 years after. We're approaching the 50th anniversary of his passing. And we not only still know that he was a writer, we know he was a great American writer, and we know the writing itself. And that kind of staying power. And I'll take the bet now if anybody wants to collect it 500 years from now. But I think 500 years from now, when we're colonizing Mars, as I say in the book, wary of aliens dropping off cookbooks, we're still going to know who Rod Serling is, and we are still going to know the writing.
I can't improve on that.
That was amazing. And it is. I'll take the bet. We'll meet up in 500 years. I can't even tell you how many times, just for no reason, it's a cookbook comes out of my mouth. Like anytime like something's coming up where you don't like, what is this? It's a cookbook. It's such a great, it's one of the greatest. That's one of the greatest twists, I think. I love. I love. So I thank you guys I know you guys are doing a whirlwind tour and everything and talking a lot about this, but I do so appreciate you carving a little bit of your time out to hang with me. It was an honor.
I appreciate you both for caring about my dad.
Love your dad, love the show, love everything. So it's meant a lot to me in terms of my writing. And I always say, like, I was a stand-up comic, and I know Twilight Zone obviously isn't stand-up comedy, but I always say, like, oh, I learned how to write and I do comedy based on the Twilight Zone. I mean, just because when you think about the pattern of comedy, it's the twist at the end that's what's funny. It's the pattern of three, and at the very end, you change the perspective of what the people were listening. And so, I just applied it to comedy, which is the rule there. And it's like, but I feel like I learned it and really believed it from watching the Twilight Zone. Just so many memories of just little TV, black and white, watching it.
Well, Twilight Zone was not truly a horror show, but it had episodes which were, what you would call horror episodes. That they had episodes that were science fiction episodes or fantasy, but
Right.
Horror was an aspect, and horror and humor are twins. They're flip sides of the same coin. So when you say you learn something from that, that's not really very surprising, because truly they are that closely related, and they are the two basic metaphoric devices we use to deal with subjects we don't like to think about. And how much of comedy is based on pain? How much of comedy? I mean, nobody gets up there and as a stand-up comic and says, "Hey, my life's great." That's not where it starts, is it? It never starts there. And they both tend to address big themes, really big, powerful themes. And they're the way we do it. They're the two ways we do it. And they're also the two forms that don't tend to get a lot of respect. They're the ones we dismiss, and you write those two forms. It's sort of like the literary equivalent of eating at the children's table, but they are the two hardest forms to write and to master. It's another reason I think, again, that Rod Serling understood that too, and he understood the horrors of that we're capable of, and that does come out of his war experiences. Anne's right. If it weren't for the war, I don't think he would have become a writer.
Yeah, it's the path they chose, and then we're all here talking about it. And I guess, you know, he turned all that pain into just a lot of amazing stories, metaphors, things that we can still learn from today. So it's an incredible testament. So thank you both. Just one more time, I'll just say, as I knew him, my dad, Rod Serling, if you, like many people grew up loving Rod Serling and Twilight Zone, Anne's book should be at the top of your list. And Mark's book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, is just a great way to kind of understand and kind of dive into all the amazing lessons that we learn from the Twilight Zone. Thank you both very much.
Thanks so much.